It's just not spread evenly all over the world. And in a way, the future has already happened in South Africa. And what I mean by that is that there are certain policies that people in the West, people in America, and so forth are flirting with that have already been implemented in South Africa, and you can see the consequences. And so South Africa was this, they called it the South African experiment in the early 90s. Now they call it the South African project. This sort of new experiment, or to say, listen, this is what we're going to try. We're going to have this new identity, this artificial identity, statist identity, however you want to frame it. And we're going to sort of superimpose this on everyone. It's almost globalism, but on a small scale, because South Africa is a very diverse country. It's a multi-communal country. In other words, a bunch of different cultures, languages, and so forth. And now we are being told that...
And racial, not just black and white. There's a big Indian population, too.
Yes, exactly. And now you are being told that there was a saying by Samora Machel from Mozambique, who said, for the nation to prosper, the tribe must die. And what that effectively means is for the South African project to prosper, these natural identities that people have, should be suppressed. It's like saying on a bigger scale, it's the same thing as saying for globalism to prosper, nations have to die. Or you have to you can be an American and you can believe in the American dream, but only in as far as it doesn't stand in the way of this globalist project.
Yes. And
I think that's, so South Africa is in a way an experiment that has already been implemented, and we can see what happened. I mean, we can talk about corruption and all of that in South Africa, and I think that's the reason why it's so difficult to talk about the problem in South Africa, because you get quite aggressively shut down, and if you say there's a problem in South Africa.
Well, so in the United States, affirmative action became the law in the 1960s, almost right immediately, I think within a year after the Civil Rights Act of 1965 passed, which was the law that really undid the vestiges of segregation in the American South, and it said that's illegal, you can't do that anymore. Yeah. And within a year, the federal government was saying, well, actually what we're going to do is we're going to continue to discriminate, but in the other direction. Yeah. Racism is still the law. It's just now it's for a better reason. And the idea was this is going to be temporary. And of course, it hasn't been temporary. It's been more than 50 years, and it's accelerating with greater intensity and ferocity and more hatred behind it. In South Africa, it seems like it's even gone farther than that.
Yes. I think there's two different things that seem to be contradicting, but it's not. The one thing is, I spoke about the natural identities.
Yes.
South Africa has Zulus and Xhosas and a bunch of different communities and traditional communities who really want to protect and preserve their heritage. And that's important, and it should be done. And a lot of these traditional leaders feel like they're being suppressed by the South African government. There's a whole story about that as well, how traditional leaders are sort of being disrespected and so forth. So that on the one side, but then there's also, in terms of the ANC who's running the country, who openly, just yesterday, they spoke about, their friendship with the Communist Party of China, and they're still very big supporters of the Soviet Union and all of these things. So there is, as far as the government is concerned, to put it frankly, there's a very strong anti-Western sentiment underneath this whole thing. And that's part of the reason why it's so controversial to speak out against this, because there's an anti-Western sentiment in America as well, which is, sad and ironic. And there's an anti-Western sentiment in Europe as well. So to sort of speak out, you can say, there's corruption in South Africa and crime and so forth. But when you start to say, well, maybe we should take one step back and ask a question, isn't part of the problem isn't corruption and crime and all of these things, are they not maybe symptoms of a problem as opposed to the problems themselves? And when you ask that question, it's a form of blasphemy in a sense.
And so what is the core problem that gives rise to these symptoms?
I would say the core problem is that South Africa, as I said, South Africa is the system that we have in South Africa is an experiment that was based on an assumption that turned out to be false.
What was that assumption?
The assumption is that you can change people's identities through statism, through having a state, and by telling people that you need to sort of step back from your natural identity with which you freely associate, your cultural identity, and you need to take up this new identity. And so in South Africa, people would say, you can be an Afrikaner or a Boer or whatever, you can be that, but for the South African project to work, you have to put that on the backside. It has to be on the back burner. And it didn't work. That's the problem. So it created a new friction. And there's one of the theory was if you just force people together, then friction is going to go away over time. And there's been studies about this. Thomas Sowell wrote about it in the 80s, and it's just not that simple. It's social engineering and trying to sort of use the government or the state to sort of create this new identity, umbrella identity. It's not that simple. It's like saying you can be French or German as long as it doesn't stand in the way of the European project. It's the same thing.
Right.
And in South Africa, it has been tried to a fairly large extent, and we find now that the system it's just not working.
You've seen an exodus, I think it's fair to call it that, a huge number of people emigrating from South Africa to Australia, Botswana, New Zealand, Texas, the United States. Why have so many people left?
People are concerned about the future. They are concerned about their children. They are concerned about race discrimination. They are concerned about violence. I remember back in '94, the first person I knew left South Africa, and it was like I was small, I was a kid, very small, but it was sort of, the whole town talked about it. Now you can't, if you live in South Africa, everyone, well, at least in my frame of reference, everyone knows a bunch of people who have left the country. But I don't think everyone's going to leave. I think a lot of people have left, but I'm quite convinced that our community, at least, will still have a future in South Africa.
Yeah. Well, unlike a lot of the English South Africans, Afrikaners don't have another passport. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. It's not. We are a community that was developed or that was born in South Africa. We literally named ourselves after the continent, the Afrikaners. So it's not like we have we can't go to England. I've been to the Netherlands, for example. I don't feel at home in the Netherlands. It's a great country, but it's not my country. It's not my home. Yeah. So, and I think that's why a lot of people who have left, some of them have come back, said, listen, it's just, I can't, and people joke about it. They say, I can't live in a country where I can't see warthogs and rhinos, for example. And people, I think part of the reason is people to leave a country, to be pushed out of a country, is you lose a sense of your identity as well, and your sense of belonging. And it's like constructive dismissal at a company. You resign, you leave, you quit your job because you just can't. You want to work at this company, but it's just not possible anymore.
Yes.
So people are leaving not because they want to, but because they get pushed out.
You said they're leaving in part because of race discrimination.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Well, we have a bunch of race laws in South Africa, black economic empowerment, BEE laws, as they call it, affirmative action laws. We have the PEPUDA law, which is the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. There's a series of laws like this that basically says, and this is how they frame it. They say the goal is equality. We need to promote equality in South Africa, and the way the South African government does it is to say that every sphere of society has to represent the demographics of the country. And in as far as it doesn't, that's evidence of systemic racism. Now, if you are part of a minority that are, for example, 8% of the population, that means that people from your group in which you sort of categorized by this law, you can only be more than 8% of a particular company. And if you are more, then that's evidence that you are sort of still controlling things. And so that's sort of the ideology, how it's pushed. But it's pushed through in a variety of different ways. Students, for example, going to study at a university, applying, and then there would be different criteria for different races. And then people just don't get in, especially for things like medicine and so forth. Go study abroad. Bunch of examples like that.
So it makes it hard to get a job.
Well, and here's something that's really interesting. Yes and no. So this is this phenomenon that people sort of they were having trouble explaining this. Once these laws were implemented, something strange happened, which was that white people in South Africa got richer. And the question, so on average, and the question is, how did this happen?
Where people got richer?
Yeah, on average. And there's an important lesson to that, because in the previous system, white people in South Africa were dependent on the state, on the government. The government was caring for them, and they were working for the government and so forth. And they were sort of forced out of this, And to survive, you had basically one option left. You had to start your own company. And so people were sort of pushed into entrepreneurship. So that's an important lesson about state dependency, because what's happening in South Africa is an aggressive push to make people, either to push them out, one section of the population, and the other section to make them dependent on the government. But the negative spin-off of this, of course, is that racial friction increases because inequality. We're not solving the inequality problem. So these policies that we've been trying for 20 years that have failed, we just need to implement them more aggressively, and then we're gonna reach this equality. The joke about real socialism has never been tried. So we haven't done it properly. So maybe if we make
I don't think it's a joke for the people in charge. Actually, they mean it.
Yeah, well, they would say it. So land reform is a good example in South Africa. Government's own statistics, they would say that 90% of government land reform projects have failed. 90%. And now their solution to that is they need to implement those same policies just more aggressive. If it's more aggressively implemented, then maybe we'll just cross that barrier someday. So that wasn't real socialism. We need to be a little bit more aggressive.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.